Good morning. You have to forgive me. I went to print off my sermon this morning and my printer was not printing. So we are going to do it the not so old-fashioned way, and I'm going to read my notes off my phone here. So if you see me squinting up here, it's not because I'm mad, I promise. As you can see, if you look at the bulletin, our first text we're going to be looking at is going to be in 2 Timothy chapter 1. It'll kind of lead to the beginning of what we're going to get into this morning. 2 Timothy chapter 1, reading verse 7, it says, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." And we're going to be talking about that this morning, is strengthening the mind. If Dan had gotten any closer to my sermon, I might have had to say something this morning, talking about the spirit and how we strengthen it. But when you think about the human mind, it's an amazing thing. It is both strong and weak. It is both fragile but persistent. It is both moldable but unchanging. It is both restricted but limitless. It is both predictable and unreadable. And God designed it that way, and He gave man a mind with free will and choice. God made our minds and our spirit in His own image, a force in our life on earth. When we read this text in 2 Timothy, what do you, if you think about it to yourself, what does a sound mind look like? What is the example of someone with a sound mind? And how do you obtain a sound mind? Our mind must be sound, and we cannot achieve a sound mind without knowing how to properly use it. I'm not going to give you a psychology evaluation this morning, but what molds a mind is trials, mistakes, success, lessons learned, sometimes the easy way and sometimes the hard way. That's what molds the mind. It's what makes it endure, makes it adapt. And failing to do so as a Christian, allowing ourselves to make mistakes and learn by them and not feel sorry for ourselves, take what we've learned and move on. Or when we are faced with trials, using the tools that we have this morning. Again, if Dan hadn't so close to it, it wouldn't sound like a broken record this morning. But if you would turn over with me to Matthew chapter 16, we're going to look at some different aspects on how we can strengthen our mind spiritually. In Matthew chapter 16, and we're going to start in verse 21. Matthew 16, starting in verse 21, it says, "For that time Jesus began to show His disciples that He must go to Jerusalem." No, is that 16? Yes, it is. "And suffer many things from the elders, from the chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and be raised the third day. Then Peter took Him aside and began to rebuke Him, saying, 'Far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you.' But He turned and said to Peter, 'Get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but of the things of men.'" First and foremost, for us as Christians, to have a sound mind spiritually, we have to take man's opinion out of it. And this world is so full of that today, where man's opinion is law. And as Christians, we need to not feed into that. We need to make God's law first and foremost in our minds, otherwise we will lead ourselves right into temptation. And we see this example here in Matthew that shows that. But the strength of our mind should never stop growing. That's the thing that I grew up seeing a lot. I was really fortunate to grow up in a congregation with lots and lots and lots of kids. All of us kids made up more than half of the congregation. And I can remember from the time I was barely able to talk and walk, they had us all shoved in little classrooms, and we were learning all the books of the Bible, and we were learning about all the accounts in the Old Testament and the New Testament, all the what people often call stories. And we were just constantly being fed more and more and more information. and our minds were constantly growing. And I've been very blessed and very fortunate to learn a lot of things and gain a lot of knowledge about the Bible, and it has set me up a lot for success spiritually. But if we don't ever stop growing, there gets to be a point where you kind of see people, they get baptized and they're on fire for the Lord, and they're adamant and they're zealous, and then everybody just kind of plateaus and we can stop growing. And if you're not growing, then you're dying spiritually. If you're not constantly pushing yourself, then you're not getting stronger. The Hebrew writer, if we turn over to Hebrews, gives us instruction concerning this. In Hebrews chapter 5, Hebrews chapter 5, and we're going to start in verse 12. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are of full age, that is, those who, by reason of use of their own senses, exercise to discern both good and evil. And when we read this, we often use this to make points often like this, that we can't plateau and that we constantly need to be growing. But how often, if somebody asked you a question about, for example, something in the New Testament, take for example, well, why don't you use instruments? What verses do you go to? How do you combat that argument? Do you say, well, the preacher says that we're supposed to do psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs? I don't really know what that means, but that's what he tells us. Then we're still just babes. We haven't grown. We haven't adapted. And when you learn, sometimes on your own, you'll come up with questions. When you study by yourself, you will find coming up with questions. I know Dan can confirm this. I know Dad can confirm this. And I'm sure Paul can too, is when you lead a class, you know who learns the most when leading a class? Is the teacher. Every time I've ever led a class, I have learned more than everybody in the room. I guarantee it. Because it forces you to prepare for those questions that inevitably somebody's going to throw a curveball at you. And you have to be ready to answer those questions. If we do that just in our personal lives, we can be way more equipped to deal with questions of people in just our day-to-day lives, people of the world, people who might not even know anything about the Bible and they're just simply curious. And the difference between them being more curious and disregarding the Bible altogether can be our response. And sometimes that's the difference between being successful as bringing someone to Christ and failing. So as we strengthen our minds, our strength must be accompanied with love. Knowing all the right verses to say and all the right things to say doesn't necessarily make a good presentation to someone. That's what the world often calls a Bible thumper. Is somebody that just takes the information and tries to shove it down somebody's throat and saying, this is what you have to do and this is why you have to do it. But if you don't execute it in a way of love, in a way of care and genuineness towards someone, then your mind has not adapted in a way that is helpful or beneficial to those around you. And we see this over in Colossians. If you turn with me to Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3, and we're going to start in verse 12. Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another, and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, you must also forgive them. But above all these things, put on love, which is the bond of perfection. And let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which also you were called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. And when we read this verse, We actually went over this not too long ago. But when we read over these verses, notice how it talks about in verse 12, us as the elect, that to be tender mercy, kindness, humility, and meekness, long-suffering, things that we've heard many, many times before. But dealing with people in the world, how hard is it sometimes to be tender when somebody is maybe a little bit aggressive with you when they ask you questions, or maybe they're of a different faith and they kind of come off antagonistic? How hard is it really to be tender and gentle with them? Sometimes it's pretty easy to come back with as much aggression and as much resentment towards them as they shot with you. And that is the difference between someone who can do that and someone who can't, someone who has a spiritual mind and a strong mind, one that is not easily tossed to and fro. But how do you do that? Build that mindset. Well, I can tell you for a fact, it's not by yourself. Obviously, we draw off from the Lord, but it's also very, very important that we draw from our brothers and sisters in Christ. And we see that over in Romans chapter 12. If you turn back with me to Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12, and we're going to read the first few verses, and then we're going to jump a little bit further ahead. Starting in verse 1. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is good and acceptable and perfect will of God. For I say, through grace given to me, everyone who is among you, not think to himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt with each one a measure of faith. If you stay in the same chapter, but if you turn over to verse 16, it says, be of the same mind toward one another, and do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble, and do not be wise in your own opinion. It's funny how us as human beings, we are made in God's image, and we are built with all these emotions. And I think often we think that these emotions are, some emotions just get a bad rap for merely existing. Anger, for example. Jesus was angry. Anger by itself is not necessarily a sin. The difference between it being a sin and it being acceptable is whether you let it control you or not. Jesus was angry. He drove people out of the temple that had no business being in there. But he didn't let it control him. God gave us all of these emotions that is part of our mind. It's part of the human chemistry, the human psyche. And we're given these things that they can be tools or they can be stumbling blocks to ourselves. And we can only build up those emotions properly and in a healthy way if we build off of people around us. Nobody got mentally stable by being by themselves. Isolation is the only thing that Satan needs. That's what Satan wants. He wants you to be alone and by yourself with no one to protect you, nobody to help you. That is the ideal situation for Satan. But it's a lot harder to take on a whole congregation of people that are tied so knitly together that you can't separate any one of them. That's a lot harder task for him. And that also shows to the world how much stronger we are is when we're together. And we're of the same mind, and not just of the same mind, but of a strong spiritual mind. So we can't fool ourselves into thinking we can stand on our own. Instead, another verse that we'll look at that further emphasizes the point of our brothers and sisters is in Galatians chapter 6. In Galatians chapter 6. Because even though we are so tightly knit together, this does not make us invincible. In Galatians chapter 6, starting verse 1, it says, Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, Restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourselves, lest you also be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. I've been in a lot of different congregations in my lifetime. I've had an opportunity to meet lots of great folks. I have also seen some congregations that struggled, whether it was in number, whether it was financially, sometimes it was spiritually. Divisions amongst each other, issues amongst each other, gossiping, etc. And that is the one thing we cannot afford to have in a congregation, because the only way Satan should ever be able to stand up to us is if he came back in the flesh. And we know that's not going to happen anymore. But it's a lot easier than you'd think for him to make it fall apart from the inside. It's happened. It happened back in the 60s. You can look at it historically. There's been divisions amongst the church as long as the church began. Satan will always find something to use for people to be at each other's throats and to divide each other, which is really hard for us to combat because the human mind is often carnal. And so when someone makes a mistake, it's very easy to turn your nose up to them and kind of take the high and mighty approach and think of yourself a little bit better than you did yesterday because somebody else made a mistake and you weren't the one that made the mistake this time. That doesn't help us. That doesn't help us at all. Like we read here, you who are spiritual, and I would like to think that everybody in this room is spiritual, bear one another with gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also fall. So we can't do it alone. But this can apply to really any relationship, not just our relationship in the church. It could be in your own personal family. If you turn over to Ecclesiastes, we're going to go to the Old Testament, and we're going to use a verse that is often used for other reasons. In Ecclesiastes chapter 4, you probably know most of this passage by heart. You've heard it probably at any wedding you've ever been to. It's often taken out of context. People think it's talking about a husband and wife, but it's actually talking about people who follow God together and make God the center of their life. In Ecclesiastes chapter 4, starting in verse 9, it says, 2 are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him. Again, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, 2 can withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. I know for me, it's pretty hard for me to ask for help. I'm not very good at it. I like to think I'll just do it myself, and I'll figure it out one way or another, because I don't want to inconvenience somebody, and I don't want to feel like I owe somebody something. I don't like that feeling. However, we can't do that in our spiritual lives. We can't afford to. While you might think you're really, really strong, that's what Satan's going to use against you, is your pride and your thinking that you're stronger by yourself than with help. And when we read all these verses like this, it's very, very easy for us to say, yeah, you're right, Cole. These verses are right. We can all nod our heads at the morning, and then, we go back to our lives and continue doing exactly what we've always done, just kind of go on autopilot, keep living how we've been living. And I'm not expecting my sermon to do anything special to anybody this morning, but it's pretty easy to kind of see life as a routine and to let our spiritual mind just sit idly. And I am here this morning, brothers and sisters, to tell you that I have recently been struggling spiritually, mentally. And this sermon's more for me than anybody else. And I'd ask for the prayers and the encouragement of the brethren here. But in conclusion, if there's anyone else here this morning who may be struggling, or whatever your need may be this morning, we'd ask you to please come to the front as we stand and sing.